The courtroom was colder than I'd expected, despite the summer heat outside. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, and the sterile air felt thick with tension. My fingers trembled slightly as I smoothed the creases in my navy blue skirt. I hadn't worn this suit since my last Investa pitch over a year ago, but today felt like I needed armor. Across the aisle sat Derek, my soon-to-be ex-husband. He wore the same smug expression he'd had through every mediation session, as if the entire legal process were just another business deal for him to win. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man with slicked-back hair, whispered something in his ear, prompting Derek to smirk in my direction. Made me sick. We'd been married for 11 years. I'd supported him when he was just starting out, working 12-hour days at a job he hated. Back then, we barely had enough to pay the rent. I took freelance design work and sold handmade jewelry online to keep us afloat. We lived frugally. No vacations, no luxuries, just dreams and ramen. But things changed when my idea took off. I launched Willow & Hart, a lifestyle brand focused on sustainable home goods, from our garage. I built the website myself, designed the logo on my old MacBook, and poured my soul into every product description and customer email. At first, it was just me and a few part-time helpers. Then came a viral Instagram post. Then the orders flooded in. By year 5, we had our own warehouse. By year 7, we were featured in Elle Decor. And by year 10, Willow & Hart was valued at over $4.2 million. And now, here we were, divorcing. And he wanted half. Not just of the savings or the house or the stocks. He wanted half of my company. The very thing I had built from scratch, while he shrugged and said, "It's cute that you're doing this Etsy thing." He claimed he had supported me, that he had contributed by managing the finances and advising on branding. In truth, he'd done none of those things. He hadn't once stepped foot in the warehouse. He hadn't stayed up with me for 2 a.m. inventory audits. His support was nodding vaguely when I vented about supply chain issues. The judge entered, a dignified woman with steel-gray hair and an air of no-nonsense authority. Her eyes swept across the room like a lighthouse beam, steady and precise. We rose. We sat. The proceedings began. Derek's lawyer stood first, confidently outlining his client's demands. They spoke about marital assets, about joint contribution to the growth of the business, about how Derek had been an essential pillar behind the success of Willow & Hart. I didn't flinch. I let them talk. When it was our turn, my attorney Megan, quiet, unassuming but razor-sharp, stood up and walked to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," she began calmly, "we believe the truth of ownership lies not in words, but in documentation." She handed over a thick folder. The judge took it, flipping through its contents with deliberate slowness. Inside were business registration forms dated a year before Derek ever even acknowledged my work. Bank statements showing only my name on every account. Trademark certificates with my signature, invoices addressed to me, and emails from vendors, designers, and investors, all sent to me. Megan continued. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have sworn affidavits from 6 employees, all testifying that Mr. Langley had no involvement in the operations, management, or creative decisions of Willow & Hart." Derek shifted uncomfortably. His smirk faded. But Megan wasn't done. "We'd also like to introduce a piece of digital evidence," she said, pressing a button on her laptop. A large screen flickered to life, showing a video. It was a clip from one of my behind-the-scenes interviews on YouTube, filmed just last year. In the video, I was sitting on the patio of our house, explaining the brand's origin story. I smiled as I spoke. My husband didn't really believe in the company at first. He thought it was a hobby. I remember he once said, "I'll be impressed when you make $1 million." I laughed. We hit that in year 3. The judge turned to Derek. "Mr. Langley," she said, "do you dispute that the business was established independently by your wife, without your participation?" Derek's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She used our garage," he mumbled weakly. "That's community property." The judge blinked. And you believe the use of a garage entitles you to half of a multimillion-dollar business you had no hand in building? Silence. Derek's lawyer tried to recover, but the damage was done. The judge leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, and said what I had waited so long to hear. Based on the evidence presented, it is the court's opinion that Willow and Hart is and always has been the sole property of Ms. Langley. Mr. Langley is not entitled to equity, profits, or control of the company. The court will proceed with asset division excluding the business. I felt the tears build behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not yet. Later, as the hearing wrapped up and Derek's shoulders sagged in defeat, I stood tall. I didn't look at him as I walked past. Not when I left the courtroom. Not when I stepped into the sunlight outside. I had walked into that room with everything to lose. I walked out with everything I had built. And I never looked back. As I stepped outside the courthouse, the heat of the July sun wrapped around me like a victory I hadn't dared to believe in until that moment. The metal handle of the door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the sterile courtroom, the lies, the demands, and the last 11 years of compromise. Megan joined me a moment later, squinting against the glare. "You held your ground," she said with a quiet nod. "He didn't stand a chance." I nodded, trying to find words. "Thank you. For believing me. For believing in me." She gave a small smile. "You did the hard part. You built something real, and you protected it." I watched as Derek exited the courthouse behind us, his lawyer in tow, both of them speaking in low, clipped voices. He didn't look at me, not this time. The confidence he had worn so arrogantly all through the hearings was gone, replaced by something more desperate and hollow. I wondered briefly what story he'd tell people now that he'd failed to take what he couldn't create himself. But I didn't care. Let him explain to his friends why he'd lost. Let him say whatever he wanted about me. The truth was in the documents. The truth had been spoken. I got into my car, the leather seats hot beneath me, and just sat there with the engine off. I could have driven straight home, but where was home now? The house we'd shared was already on the market. We had agreed to sell it. His name had been on the deed, even if his heart had never lived in its walls. I was staying temporarily in a small studio downtown, walking distance from the Willow and Hart flagship store. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I pulled out my phone and opened the Willow and Hart Instagram account. There were dozens of unread DMs and notifications. My assistant Lila had sent a message earlier that morning. "Everything's prepped for next week's product launch. No rush, just breathe. We got you." Smiled. They did. I started driving toward the studio, but halfway there, I turned down a familiar side street and pulled into a quiet parking lot. The warehouse. The heart of my company. It was empty at this hour, but I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. Rows of shelves held carefully boxed merchandise. Linen throws, hand-poured candles, ceramic kitchenware, recycled paper journals. All of it labeled with the logo I'd sketched one night at our old kitchen table. Name. My vision. I walked to the office at the back, unlocked the door and flicked on the light. The same corkboard was still up on the wall, pinned with Polaroids from the early days, sticky notes with product ideas, color swatches. There was one photo in particular that always made me pause. It showed me and Lila holding the very first shipping box we ever sent out, grinning like fools, exhausted and proud. I sat down in the office chair and let out a long breath. The storm had passed. The man who had once promised to love me had tried to dismantle everything I'd built, but all he'd succeeded in doing was showing me just how strong I really was. He had underestimated me, and that would haunt him more than any courtroom ruling. I picked up a pen and pulled out a fresh page from the legal pad on my desk. Across the top, I wrote in big block letters, "New Era Plan." Underneath it I wrote, "Expand into wellness line. Hire a CFO, finally. Write that Forbes Women guest column. Celebrate." Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, "Fall in love again." Someday, but only if it feels like peace, not war. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and for the first time in months I felt calm. The fight was over. The judge had seen the truth. And so had I. I didn't just win the case. I reclaimed myself. And now I was free. As the sun dipped low behind the warehouse windows, casting long golden shadows across the concrete floor, I stood up and turned off the lights. The quiet hum of the building comforted me. Familiar, steady, mine. I walked back out into the fading evening, locking the door behind me with a final, satisfying click. The chapter with Derek was over. No more battles. No more proving my worth to someone who never truly saw me. In the courtroom, he'd tried to take half of what I created. But what he didn't understand, what he never understood, was that Willow and Hart wasn't just a company. It was my resilience. It was my independence. It was the story of a woman who built something beautiful out of silence and doubt. And no one could take that from me. I got into my car, rolled down the windows, and let the warm wind rush in as I drove back toward the city lights, toward my new home, toward my new life. And somewhere between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, I smiled, for real this time. Because the divorce was just an ending. But this was a beginning.